Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Andrew Cockburn about the history of drone warfare and the use of drone warfare in the War on Terror. Mr. Cockburn is Washington editor for Harper's Magazine and the author of Kill Chain: The Rise of the High-Tech Assassins. You can follow his work at harpers.org, and you can find him on Twitter at Andrew M. Cockburn. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/drones. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be with you.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. So let's get started by having sort of an overview of what we mean by drone warfare and then how it was used prior to the War on Terror.
Well, what we mean by drone warfare is really this practice which has become a sort of certainly the principal strategy, I would say, of the Obama administration is remote control warfare. The idea, the using drones controlled from, this country to carry out operations, really operations of assassination, as it turns out, in very distant places, Africa, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's not all they're used for. Drones, as we can discuss in a second, drones, and especially prior to 9/11, were conceived originally as a surveillance device. The idea was you could use a drone and send it over territory you wanted to look at, and it would send you back instant pictures, and you would see what was going on. And from that developed the notion of using it to actually kill people, to kill the people it was surveying.
Okay, so prior to the War on Terror, how were drones used and when were they used? I guess they were used in the drug war and they played a role in Kosovo. Can you go through some of the uses of drones prior to the War on Terror?
Well, really, they go back further than people realize. They were used in Vietnam for reconnaissance, not very effectively. They fired off thousands. I think it was something called the Firebird, which were used in great numbers. Not very satisfactory results. They tended to prove unreliable, but there was an industrial push behind them, so they were used. Then, as so often happens, let me jump ahead of myself slightly and say that the trouble with drones is they're very vulnerable. They're very easy to shoot down, so they're only really useful in a sort of Third World War. They were shot down in great numbers in Vietnam. And then they started to come back into favor after the end of the Cold War in the Balkans initially, because there we were, we're dealing with, comparatively low-level civil wars where no one had, or at least was interested in using sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses. So it was okay to send a drone over. So they were the Predator drone, which was the one that's become a sort of, I guess, the symbol of the War on Terror. That was initially used in the Balkans in the mid-90s, again, with rather unsatisfactory results. It proved extremely unreliable, couldn't really operate in any kind of bad weather. The wings iced up all the time. It kept crashing. Nevertheless, there was quite a lot of sort of service, military-industrial complex push behind it, and it got used more intensely in the Kosovo War in 1999, where it particularly attracted sort of high-level commanders like General Wesley Clark, who was the overall NATO commander, because it offered the prospect of the remote supreme commander, as he was, and other four-star generals like him, of actually being almost present on the battlefield. They could look at the monitor on their desk, and they could have close-up views of what was going on the ground. It didn't actually sort of really tell them very much because they're miles away, and this was like something sort of information a platoon leader might need, not a four-star general. Nevertheless, they were entranced by this. Then, after that, in 2000, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was already a sort of looming threat on the horizon, even before the official launch of the War on Terror. So in 2000, the fall of 2000, the CIA sent a Predator drone, which of course was unarmed, as they all were at that time, over southern Afghanistan, looking at various places of interest, including a place called Tarnak Farms, where it was thought that Osama bin Laden, might hang out occasionally. And the pictures it brought back electrified Washington, because it showed, actually what the picture showed was a white dot, which we presume was a human being, walking down a village street surrounded by black dots, which was interpreted as being bodyguards. And this was absolutely accepted. This was Osama bin Laden himself, attended by numerous bodyguards. And the next thought that went around Washington was, oh my God, if only we'd had a missile on that thing, we could have taken out Osama bin Laden there and then. And so immediately the order went out to fit the Predator drone with a missile, with the Hellfire missile, as it so happened, which was originally an anti-tank missile developed to be airdropped by a manned plane. And they did that quite quickly and effectively. And so that was the birth of the drone as an assassination weapon. And so that was ready in time for 9/11 and the unveiling of the War on Terror.
All right, now I want to take a step back to a little bit before the War on Terror. What role did drones play in U.S. government efforts to go after drug cartels and cartel leaders in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America?
Well, they did send a drone to try and, a helicopter drone as it so happened, to try and find Pablo Escobar, the famous or infamous leader of the Medellin cartel. But there was an aspect, not so much the drone aspect of this kind of warfare, but the assassination aspect was deployed in the drug war. And it's really very significant for what has been going on more recently, because in the early 90s, in 1992, in fact, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, came up with the notion of a new strategy, which they called the Kingpin strategy, which was, instead of just trying to stop drug shipments coming into this country, they would go after the kingpins, the master criminals who were directing the cartel, in charge of the drug cartels. And that would sort of disrupt the drug smuggling and marketing operations, and we'd be, one up in the war on drugs. And so they did that, and it was all sorts of bureaucratic reasons behind this. Meant they could sort of forge relationships with the NSA and the CIA, and really to get around the FBI, under whose control they'd sort of chafed for too long, in their view. So they embarked on the Kingpin strategy, and in a way it worked. They were quite successful at taking down, eliminating Pablo Escobar himself, and then the leaders of the Cali cartel, which had been at the time the largest sort of criminal organization in the world. And to that extent, the Kingpin strategy worked, in that they got rid of kingpins. But what didn't work was affecting the flow of drugs, except in an upward direction, because it turned out that when you remove the kingpin and dismantle the cartel, you then get a lot of other people. The cartels then split, and you have rival cartels all competing for the market. And how do they compete? They compete by bringing in more drugs, more cocaine or heroin, as it might be, and competing on price. So, supply and consumption, this is fundamental economics, go up. And that's what happened. So we know from what happened to the prices, we know that the Kingpin strategy actually increased the quantity of narcotics coming into this country and being available to people to buy and perhaps become addicted to. So that's the war on drugs aspect of all this.
All right, yeah, so let's move into the war on terror aspect of all this. Now, you mentioned briefly in 2000 the use of drones to what U.S. officials were hoping was to identify bin Laden.
Uh-huh.
But moving forward from there, what were some of the sort of major events and landmarks in the use of drone warfare and in their the expanded operations for them during the War on Terror?
Well, I mean, they got a kickoff really with the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. In fact, a drone was used to try and kill Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, on the first night of the war. As it so happened, it hit his car, which happened to be empty at the time, blew up his car, a Toyota Corolla, and Mullah Omar, who was nearby, then jumped on a motorbike and was actually never seen again, or at least not by any American. And he turned out he died last year, and unbeknownst to any U.S. intelligence agency. After that, he was used in rather sparingly during the Bush administration. In 2002, it was used in Yemen to kill an Al-Qaeda official, figure in Al-Qaeda. And actually, although he doesn't seem to have been a target, it was the first time they killed an American citizen who happened to be in the car with him. But for the rest of the next really significant date I would point to for drone operations, I mean, they were using it, as I said, sparingly in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. But when they knew who the target was, we know Mr. X is there, or we think we know, and we want to kill him, so they did it. I mean, the Bush administration, as many people will recall, was more interested in capturing people and torturing them to get information, and then, either sending them off to be held in some black site in an allied country or sending them to Guantanamo. That started to change in 2008, in the waning months of the Bush administration, when the CIA made a successful pitch to the White House, to President Bush, that they, instead of having to sort of wait until they absolutely knew who they were shooting at, have a specific identified target in mind, that they could shoot at someone or use drone warfare to on people or on targets that looked like terrorists, looked like an enemy. You didn't have to know who they were, but you could know, if they walked like a terrorist, talked like a terrorist, quacked like a terrorist, so to speak, then you could target them. And Bush agreed to that, and so the number of drone, assassinations started to go up. And then went up, escalated still further when Obama became president, because the whole idea of this remote killing, not involving American, putting American lives at risk, all very tidy, all very sort of surgical, almost mechanical, really appealed to President Obama, and indeed to his closest advisor on such matters, John Brennan, who initially was his counterterrorism advisor with an office almost next door to him in the White House. And Brennan and Obama were absolutely of one mind, I should say, on this policy. So the numbers steadily ticked up through 2009, and then, especially after the Taliban had struck back and killed a number of CIA officers who were on the ground in Afghanistan, a place called Host, then it became almost, the lid was off, and there were a huge number of drone strikes in 2010, most of which they didn't know who they were killing, or maybe they did subsequently, but they were, these were the so-called signature strikes, which I described earlier, when, you go on a pattern of behavior. If someone's behaving like a terrorist, then it's okay to kill them. So we proceed from there.
Okay, now you said that one of the things that supporters of the use of drones like to point out is that it doesn't put American lives at risk. But as you mentioned earlier, sometimes there are American citizens on the other end of this tactic. So how frequent have American citizens, whether targeted or accidentally, been killed or injured through the use of drone warfare?
Well, I think it's not up to now. Is it 6? I mean, there was a gentleman in 2002. Then, very famously, there was Anwar Al-Awlaki
Right.
in 2011. Then there was his son 2 weeks later. And then there was the 2 American hostages who were killed inadvertently early last year. They were being held. It was a signature strike on what was deemed, I guess correctly, to be an Al-Qaeda hideout in Pakistan. But unbeknownst to the people at this end, there were 2 foreign, one American and one Italian being kept, held prisoner there, and they were killed. So that's I make that 5. Maybe I'm missing one. The point about it is, I mean, that they, there's 2 aspects to this I find interesting. One is that killing deliberately killing an American, deliberately killing anyone for that matter, but, okay, let's say an American's a special, without due process. I mean, just the president basically signs an order for him to be executed, is pretty shocking. They did generate a sort of kind of ersatz legal justification from this, which was a pretty sorry spectacle. Really, I mean, jurists denounced it, I think quite rightly, as, not really meeting any proper legal standard. It was like thrown together by an in-house lawyer, which is not really the way one should go about killing one's own citizens or killing anyone. But the Obama administration was perfectly happy with that. Didn't see Obama's shown that after he killed Anwar al-Awlaki, who was a very, potent symbol for the jihadists, for the terrorists, if you will. Obama actually remarked to a group he happened to be talking to, he said, "Turns out I'm really good at killing people. Who would have thought it?" Which I think is a pretty amazing statement.
Yeah, no, that is a remarkable statement from him. So before we move on to some of the other issues with the use of drones, what are some of the successes that proponents of drone use claim?
Well, they claim, over the years we've got used to hearing once again they've got a senior official of Al-Qaeda, a number 2, a number 3. They always make it sound like Al-Qaeda, these terrorist organizations, are like a major U.S. corporation, IBM or Exxon or something. The head of communications, I don't think I've heard of a director of human resources being targeted, but certainly, ministers of finance. I noticed with the ISIS strikes on ISIS, we seem to keep getting the ministers of finance. But the problem is, and that sounds rather gratifying, all these probably people, if they are who they were said to be, probably may well be bad people who wish us harm, but it doesn't seem to have done us much good. This strategy, this whole doctrine of targeting enemy leaders, in Kill Chain, in my book, I sort of describe its evolution and how initially they were rather queasy about it. In the first Gulf War, for example, they wanted to kill Saddam, but they felt bad because ever since the Watergate days, there's been actually an official ban on assassination. So they the solution was to call it something else. So they called it, enemy command and control. Over the years, that's kind of been relaxed, and now, they make it. There's no two ways about it. We're trying to kill people, and we sort of edged into it. So by the time of the occupation of Iraq, dealing with the Iraq insurgency, it was the official doctrine for the war. How we were fighting the Iraqi insurgency The essential strategy was the removal of what they called HVIs, high-value individuals, who were, the leaders of insurgent cells, or they were sometimes referred to as IED cell leaders. And interestingly enough, as I reveal in Kill Chain, something not at all known otherwise, was that there was actually one intelligence analyst, a very brilliant man called Rex Rivolo, who was attached to a special intelligence cell. He was part of an intelligence cell attached to the commander in Baghdad, the ground commander. And this cell existed really to give the commander his own eyes and ears, independently of the whole vast official intelligence bureaucracy. I mean, these were all people from the Pentagon, but they reported directly to him, General Odierno. And so he knew he had good information about what was going on in the theater. So Rex Rivolo, he got to thinking about this HVI strategy, and he wondered if anyone had actually taken a proper, rigorous look on whether it worked or not. Everyone assumed, we're knocking off enemy leaders. Well, that's probably a good thing, bound to be a good thing. Just it feels right and, satisfying to get the quote-unquote bad guys. So Rex set out to do a proper test, and the way he did it was quite straightforward. He was able to get, because he had total clearance to look at anything he wanted, assembled a list of 200 insurgent leaders that they had eliminated one way or another over the previous, I think it was 4 months, up the length and breadth of Iraq. Then he got the lists of, and they were all in something that was compiled every day called SIGACTs, significant actions. What had happened in each eliminated leader's locality before and after he was dealt with. So he looked, what had been going on, 1 kilometer, 5 kilometer, 10 kilometers from the leader's base of operations for 30 days before he was killed and the 30 days after he was killed. And what it turned out was that when he was killed, attacks on Americans went up sharply. I think it was, as I recall, it was 40% in 3 days. Up within 3 days of the HVI being taken out, attacks on Americans went up by 40%, with numerous casualties. And that's not really what was meant to happen. What was meant to happen is, if this strategy works, then, attacks on Americans should go down. Life becomes better. That's what a military success is meant to lead to. But it was leading to, a much worse situation. So it was 40% in 3 days. I think in 5 days, they were still running 20% above normal. And eventually after about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, it had gone back to normal, to what it had been before, no better, no worse than before the guy was killed. So this is as far as I know, this was the only sort of proper empirical test done of this strategy, which has dominated our war on terror. And it turns out not only to be not work, it works to the advantage of the other side.
Right, yeah. It helps to build up anti-American and anti-Western sentiments. As you touched on, it works as a recruiting tool.
Right. And equally importantly, it turned out, and it seems to go on turning out, that whoever you've gotten rid of tends to be replaced immediately and replaced by someone worse, from your point of view. Replaced by someone who's almost invariably younger, more aggressive, eager to prove himself. Quite often it's a relative, so wants to, avenge Uncle Muhammad or whoever it might be, has learned from the mistakes that got the predecessor killed, so is more effective in every way.
Yeah, that seems to really be sort of the story of U.S. foreign policy these days, where when they take out one leader, then a new and worse leader replaces them.
Yes, I mean, just look at the history of ISIS. ISIS was, really the origins of ISIS was the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was, created really led by the infamous Mr. Zarqawi. And then after fantastic effort, they killed Zarqawi. And I mean, basically the whole of special forces in Iraq was directed this, to get Zarqawi, a huge effort. You can read all about it in Stanley McChrystal's memoirs. It's really the bulk of the book. So they got him, with the help of drones and F-16s and massive surveillance, and they got him. And actually then he was replaced by someone more effective, Mr. al-Masri, who didn't, repeat a lot of Zarqawi's mistakes. Masri was in turn finally eliminated. He was replaced again by Mr. al-Omar, as I remember. They got him, who was replaced by Mr. Baghdadi, who went off and founded ISIS. And now we're in a thorough-growing war. We're back in Iraq and in Syria fighting ISIS. So each one has been more effective than the last. So it's really rather a good, rather a sad example of where this kind of policy gets you.
Right. Well, and now another consequence and issue with the use of drones is the killing of innocent people and innocent civilians in the countries and regions where these drones operate, and also the destruction of property and infrastructure there. So just how devastating has the use of drones been to these communities where they've been used?
Well, one of the places has been, it's tapering off now, in northwest Pakistan, in the so-called tribal territories, which has been under relentless drone assault for years. It really disrupted the whole society because everyone, although it's not like carpet bombing, but the notion that you can be, anytime you gather in a group, you're liable, suddenly, there's an explosion and half of you are dead, means that it has a total sort of traumatizing effect on the whole society. For example, in that area, the two sort of very significant social activities when people got together were like weddings and funerals, or else what they called yurgas or jirgas, where the elders, not women, I'm afraid, but men sort of certain seniority and standing would all get together to settle some dispute or decide on an issue, a local issue. These turned out to be drone targets because the drone warriors would conclude that in that group there are some Al-Qaeda people, or maybe it was a funeral for an Al-Qaeda leader, so we'll hit the funeral. Sometimes they would hit a funeral, they would kill someone so there would be a funeral, and then and they reckoned a senior Al-Qaeda person would be bound to be there, and then they could hit the funeral and kill him. So it meant that the whole way of life changed. There was a very sort of almost very upsetting testimony a few years ago from a Pakistani child who came to Washington and testified. His grandmother had been killed for whatever reason. One hopes a mistake. She was been working in the fields and killed in a drone strike. And he said nowadays we don't play outside when it's a sunny day because we know the drones can see us. We only play outside on cloudy days. So it's this sort of whole effect over the whole society that I find quite upsetting.
So are you aware of any estimates of how many innocent people have been killed by this, and in particular how many children have been killed by this?
There are various estimates, depending on who you believe. It's very hard to quantify because this usually, by the nature of things, they happens in parts of the world that are difficult of access. But I'd say in Pakistan we have let me think overall. I'd say it's about total number of people about 5,000, of whom I think estimates of civilian casualties run to about 2,000, as I remember. Let's see, total strikes in Pakistan, 423. Total killed, estimates range up to 4,000. Civilians killed, about 1,000. Children killed, probably about 200. Many more injured. So the numbers, they're bad, and it's horrifying that so many people have been killed. What I find as bad is the sort of trauma inflicted on the whole society for the reasons I've just explained. People are afraid to go out in the open. The whole sort of random nature Then suddenly you're, walking along on a peaceful day or driving along, and suddenly the car in front of you suddenly blows up. When there's a rather old-fashioned war, like when the Pakistani army sweeps in, probably more people get killed. But that's in a way something that's more. It's I would say it's easier to deal with, or it's all more recognizable. What seems to people I've talked to, what really freaks them out is sort of the sort of very, very almost it seems unfair, that you're doing something normal. You're in a normal landscape. You're carrying on your normal business. There isn't fighting nearby. You're not in a normal state of tension, and suddenly, bang, your house is blown up. The house next door is blown up. Your car is blown up. So that's I think that's a very important aspect of it.
Well, and another aspect that leads to the randomness is some, I hesitate to say this, but I guess limitations of the drones themselves in regards to their vision capabilities. So what are the vision capabilities like of these drones, and how accurate are they?
Well, it's all sold, and if you go to see one of these sort of feature films based on drones, like in this latest one, Eye in the Sky, whether the filmmaker is taking a positive or negative attitude towards drones, they always fully endorse the technology. The view, as the drone's eye view, is always presented as being absolutely clear, crystal clear, and that doesn't seem to be the way it really is. I mean, the most striking fact is that it's got a little better more recently, but for a long time, and still very much the same, that the visual acuity, the vision ability for night, for the for the infrared, which is what the camera that's used at night, which is half the time, was 20/200. 20/20 vision is perfect vision. 20/200 is very imperfect vision. In fact, it's the legal definition for blindness for DMVs in this country. So we have, people being killed thanks to on information that's supplied by something that is legally blind. Overall, it's blurry. It's any kind of because they fly high. They have to be they want to be out of range of small arms fire, so above 5,000 feet. So a lot of the time they're just not seeing very well. I mean, this is the sort of the more secret aspect of it all. But you get occasional public clues, like in 2011, a couple of Marines, or a Marine and a Navy corpsman, were killed in Afghanistan because the people watching the drone footage, making the decisions, this one, back in this country, they couldn't distinguish between. They saw the two figures on the ground, and they couldn't. Although they were Marines, they had helmet. They were American servicemen, wearing Marines with bulletproof jackets. We all know what it looks like. Looks very different, obviously, for a Taliban fighter with a turban and loose clothes and not dressed in cover. But from the drone picture, they couldn't tell the difference. Nor could they, if they had been in the firefight, in this particular firefight, if they were friendly troops, they were firing in one direction, and if they were enemy troops, they were obviously firing in another direction. But so I'll repeat that: if they were friendly troops, they were firing in one direction, and if they were enemy troops, they were firing in another direction. Again, that was not apparent from the drone picture. So it's really, I thought, was a very telling example of how poor the visual information from a drone actually is. That you couldn't tell an American from a Taliban, you couldn't tell which direction they were firing. I've seen pictures. There's a particularly sort of one level up kind of camera array that's fitted on some drones. It's called Gorgon's Stare, which is meant to be able to to look at an entire town, and then to within that overall picture, being able to go down and pick up pictures, with a resolution of 6 inches, and that sounds miraculous. And it's, usually you look at press write-ups and they say how wonderful this is. But someone gave me some of the test reports on this thing, and in most of the pictures were no better than Google Earth, which you can get for free on any laptop. And some of the ones that were meant to be better, when they were trying to pick out humans, or they're called dismounts, individual people on the ground, you couldn't tell whether such a dot was a person, a dismount, or a bush. So again, this is something that's very much oversold. The technical proficiency or reliability of these systems, on which life and death decisions are being made.
So what are the monetary costs of this whole drone program, and what role has and is the military-industrial complex playing in making sure it continues and expands?
Well, to take the second part first, I mean, the military-industrial complex is deeply interested. In a way, for a long time, they weren't so interested because, comparatively speaking, drones were cheap. I mean, an actual Predator cost, just a Predator costs like $15 million or so, Reaper rather more. But then, as the system grew more elaborate and the whole support system grew more elaborate, it started to become more attractive. For example, a little-known part of the system, which I talk about in Kill Chain, are these centers across the country that they're called Distributed Common Ground System. And these are installations at military Air Force bases across the country where you have hundreds and hundreds of servicemen and women looking at screens. They're looking at all the drone footage. It's like the whole idea is they're looking at all the available information and really directing drone strikes. They're not flying the machines. That's done in Nevada. These are people in, for example, Virginia, Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And you'll have people looking at a whole array of screens, which is not only drone footage, but footage from U-2 reconnaissance planes, maybe even satellite pictures, signals intelligence from NSA. And they will in turn be talking to the pilots in Nevada. Anyway, it's a very elaborate system. Each of these bases costs something approaching $1 billion, and with a very heavy upkeep. Or even when they were done a few years ago now, must be more, but they cost about $1 billion to build, with very heavy maintenance and manning costs. So beyond that, now you have drones that cost a lot more. For instance, the Global Hawk drone costs upwards of $200 million a copy, because it's a huge thing which allegedly can stay up for days on end. Actually, it's rather unsatisfactory because it's very unreliable and doesn't work too well when the weather's bad, and many other deficiencies I won't bore you with. But that's built by the Northrop Corporation. And when the Air Force, who got fed up with Global Hawk because it was so unsatisfactory, it was too much even for the Air Force, tried to kill it, Northrop mounted a huge lobbying campaign, a very potent lobbying campaign, and called in a lot of chips from Congress, and the Global Hawk lived on. So it's a very significant, drones have taken their place as something that's too big to kill as far as the military-industrial complex is concerned.
So where do you think all of this is headed? What changes do you anticipate seeing in drone usage, and what, if anything, that's realistic could happen to reduce the use of drones or even bring an end to this whole drone program?
Well, I think by now, I'm not sure what could bring an end to it, because it's there are too many vested interests. But one thing that would certainly reduce their use, if not the money we spend on them, would keep them on the ground, is a war with a sort of something, with a sort of first world type enemy that has air defenses. As I said, earlier on, you can only really use them when, no one's going to be able to shoot them down. If you're up against any country with an air force, or proper anti-aircraft facilities, then they don't last very long. That's why, they went out of when their recent rise coincided with the end of the Cold War. Of course, there's all sorts of sort of fantasy plans to develop drones that will, be able to defend them, be stealthy, and be able to, fight dogfights on their own, which I think it's all cock and balls stuff. It really won't work very well. There'll be a lot of your money and mine spent on trying to achieve that. But in the end, I don't think it'll happen. As for, their use in assassination tools, it'll carry on. I mean, the problem is, as you either gather from the way I've been talking, they're not very effective. They've been heavily used in the ISIS war, both for directly killing people and from what's called buddy lasing. That's when a drone will work in sort of partnership with a manned plane. So the drone picks out the target and illuminates it with a laser, and then the bomber, or whatever it might be, a B-1 or something, releases a bomb, which then is guided by the laser beam to the target. There's been a lot of that in the ISIS war. So it's anyways, because I was starting to think a year or so ago that maybe drones would be on their way out, but actually the Air Force has proven me wrong, because they're doubling their drone fleet. So drones still have a future, at least as a source of profit for someone.
So, unfortunately, the only realistic way out may be a scenario that none of us are rooting for, with a major war between major powers.
Certainly not, yeah.
All right, well, on that note, thank you very much for joining me today. And I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but before we wrap up here, can you just go over again where our listeners can follow your work and what you recommend they read, if obviously your book, of course, but what you recommend they read if they want to learn more about this topic?
First of all, you can find what I write written on defense and other subjects if you look me up on harpers.org. And if you're reasonably restrained in the number of articles you look up, you can avoid the paywall, the dreaded paywall, or even better, subscribe to Harper's. I'd certainly want to say that. You can follow me on Twitter at Andrew M. Cockburn. That's Andrew M. Cockburn. In terms of other things to read, I would very strongly recommend online looking at the blog of Chuck Spinney, someone who's influenced me a lot. He puts out a blog. I think he calls it the Blaster. But if you just Google Chuck Spinney and you find his blog, that's well worth looking at. In terms of various one book on Afghanistan. It's away from drones, but it fits in very much with what I've been saying about what went wrong. A book called No Good Men Among the Living by Anand Gopal. It's about how we revived the Taliban in Afghanistan, really thanks to the high-value individual strategy that we wanted to, after the Taliban were defeated in 2001 and sort of gave up and went home. But we were so desperate to find enemy leaders that we managed to, arrest and torture a lot of people who weren't enemy leaders, and thus, turned the whole country against us again, and, led to the ongoing disaster of Afghanistan. Other books, if you want to know about the military-industrial complex, my favorite, you'll have to get it, secondhand from a Libris or some used book site. A book, it's quite an old book now, 20 or 30 years old, called The High Priests of Waste by A. Ernest Fitzgerald. He was a Pentagon official who became a dissident and was a famous whistleblower and got fired on the personal orders of President Nixon. I'd certainly recommend that. In terms of defense journalists, what's online? David Axe, AXE, he's a good defense reporter. There's an outfit in Washington called the Project on Government Oversight, which has a sort of an offshoot called the Strauss Military Reform Group. If you Google POGO, P-O-G-O, and military or Pentagon, they put out a lot of very interesting stuff about all the various horrific things that are going on, including the mega rip-off of the F-35 fighter, which I'd commend to everyone's attention.
All right, well, it sounds like that should help people get started, and we'll link to all of those resources at wakeupcallpodcast.com/drones. So I encourage everybody to go check that out. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/drones. And Andrew, I want to thank you again for joining me today and being so generous with your time. And hopefully we'll be able to speak with you again sometime again soon.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.